There we go. Okay, we're recording. So, welcome to all of you for the first in this series of summer presentations from our visiting scholars. All of our visiting scholars this summer are actually folks who received their fellowships last year, but couldn't come last year because we were under lockdown. So we're delighted to have them this time round for these weeks, and it's been wonderful to have them here. Two of our scholars are presenting today. I'm going to introduce them immediately, one after the other, then they will speak in turn. Our first presenter today is this year's Meter Center Faculty Fellowship recipient, Professor Amanda Eurich. She is Professor of History at Western Washington University in Bellingham, Washington, where she has taught since 1986. She's the author of numerous articles and book chapters on various aspects of the Reformation in France. Her first monograph, The Economics of Power, the Private Finances of the House of Foix-Navarre-Albret during the Wars of Religion, was published by 16th-century Press. She is currently working on a book project on the life and career of Jeanne de Coras. And indeed, her presentation to us today will focus on some aspects of that research. Her presentation is titled Coras Undercover, Rage and Resistance in the French Wars of Religion. Amanda, we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you.
Our second presenter is Dr. Preston Hill, and he is a very recently minted PhD. We're very excited. He has recently obtained his PhD, had his viva passed. Everything is great. His PhD from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, where he was a student of Professor Alan Torrance. He is a recipient of the 2020 Meter Center Student Fellowship, and we're delighted to have him here with us. His presentation this afternoon highlights some of the themes from his recent and ongoing work, and his presentation is titled The Death of the Soul, Christ's Descent into Hell in the Thought of Calvin, Lefebvre, and Cusa. So we will start with Amanda.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much for being here. It really is a pleasure to have an opportunity to present the work that I've been engaging in while I'm here at the Meter Center. And of course, I do want to thank the Meter Center and the Meter Center donors for continuing these fellowships and for agreeing to postpone them during COVID. So after a year of pandemic living and learning without a library and sometimes without access to my office, you know, it's just been a marvel to be in a library that, of course, is especially geared to those of us who love the 16th century. And it really, for me, has been kind of a moment of restoration and productivity. So I want to thank especially Corinne and Paul and Deborah, and also Sam, who is a seminary student who has sometimes been my keeper, my custodian, when I've been here working in the afternoons. And Sam and I are the kind of lone researchers working in the Meter Center as the library undergoes construction. So many of you who are here already know about the kind of larger project that I'm working on, the Life and Letters of Jeanne de Coras, a celebrated French jurist and member of the sovereign royal court or parliament of Toulouse. And the project, as I conceived it, uses his private correspondence and letters writ large as a framing device to explore the epistolary cultures of the 16th century, the radicalization of religious identities, religious war and the consequent practice of peacemaking, and the impact of war on family life and personal relationships, emotional intimacy. So, you know, the 16th century jurist Coras is largely known to Anglophone audiences as the judge who presided over a notorious case of identity theft that seized the imagination of celebrated writers such as Michel de Montaigne. In real life, Coras himself was playing a double game, just like the peasant Pansette, who briefly managed to steal the wife, the family, the property of a companion in arms, Martin Guerre. He was publicly an agent of the state, whose job was to be custodian of the laws of the Kingdom of France. But privately in the 1550s, he converted to Protestantism. In 1568, Coras was expelled from office along with 7 of his Protestant co-religionaries, all deemed guilty of heresy and treason and condemned to death in absentia. In exile, Coras joined the service of Jeanne d'Albret, titular head of the militant Protestant party in France, as her chancellor and superintendent of finance, where he oversaw the funding of the Protestant insurgency and its armies in the field. And he also began at that time honing his skills as a Protestant propagandist, publishing 2 highly inflammatory works, which situate Coras among the earliest proponents of Huguenot resistance theory. That is, that growing body of works emanating from Protestant authors that defended the right of subjects to resist or to rebel against authorities deemed tyrannical, especially the king. Now, today I'm going to focus mostly on the second work that he publishes. It appears in 1569 and then it is republished again in 1570. It is entitled A Political Question. Is it legitimate for subjects to negotiate with their prince? And in this work, Coras develops a highly original challenge to the established conventions of royal power and authority that finds reverberations in Theodore Beza's Du droit des magistrats sur le sujet, right, the right of magistrates over their subjects, and the work of other so-called resistance theorists. So thinking through the substance of Coras' argument and possible connections to the emergent literature of Protestant resistance has been the greater part of my work at the Meter Center. So I'd like to preface, my discussion of this text with some observations about the world of clandestine print and publication. It's clear from Coras' correspondence that by November of 1568, he had joined Jeanne d'Albret in the Atlantic port city of La Rochelle, which served as kind of command central for the Protestant party from 1568 to 1571. And in La Rochelle, he was extremely busy carrying out the task of, drumming up monies from various sources to kind of fund the Protestant insurgency. But he was also working in close collaboration with a Rochelet printer named Barthélemy Berton to bring to fruition 2 manuscripts, both published under deep cover. Right? Both were published anonymously. In the first instance, a pamphlet entitled, lovely 16th century title, The Iniquities, Abuses, Nullities, Injustices, Oppressions, and Tyrannies of the Decree by the Parliament of Toulouse against the Councillors of Religion, seized with self-righteous rage and indignation. And still nursing wounds from his humiliating expulsion from public office, Jean seizes the opportunity to settle old scores against longtime rivals in the Parliament of Toulouse, penning a very bitter denunciation of the treatment he and his co-religionaries received at the hands of their colleagues. This pamphlet is, I think, particularly interesting because although it was published anonymously, Jeanne used the opportunity to kind of strike a blow at some of his enemies in Toulouse in the title page itself. So there's a kind of purportedly this is published by one of the most ardent Catholic printers in Toulouse. And it purports to come with an authorization, a privilege from the Parliament of Toulouse, no less. Right? The second pamphlet, the Question or treatise Question Politique, was also published, it appears, in 1569 for the kind of first time. Again, there is no indication kind of the author or printer, although the place of publication, Poitiers, was almost certainly Toulouse, La Rochelle is indicated, along with an intriguing tag that we find on a lot of the pamphlets published by Berton in the late 1560s and 1570s, newly printed. Okay. Coras' decision, after affixing his name to so many treatises, to suddenly kind of go underground, this deliberate act of concealment, I think, is another sign that his formal association with Jeanne d'Albret and the militant wing of the Huguenot party had forever altered the trajectory of his legal and literary career. And although different in style and substance, both texts shared a similar objective to legitimate the actions of the Protestant insurgency and its agents, right, driven underground by tyrannical authorities to take up arms in defense of freedom of conscience. Now, both texts as I suggested, circulated independently at first, but in 1570, they're united in a massive compendium of Huguenot polemical works entitled The History of Our Times, L'Histoire de Notre Temps, that is attributed to two fictitious printers, Christophe Landré and C. Martel. Almost certainly this work was also this compendium was also the work of Barthélemy Bertrand. And one of the exciting things for me about my research here at the Meter Center is that I finally was able to locate, not at the center itself, but online, a recently digitized copy, of this massive kind of compendium, a truncated version from the British Library. And in the 1570 collection, it's clear that these two texts are printed kind of right in the middle of the volume, together, separated by a couple of sonnets that describe portentous or prophetic portents over the Palais, that is the Parliament of Toulouse. And I think these were, poems that were probably also penned by Coras. And nasty little philippics on the corruption of the courts and its counselors. Okay. So today I really want to focus on the larger, more studied work of political philosophy entitled A Political Question. And Coras' central argument or assertion that subjects can and should claim the right to negotiate, or the word he uses is capituler, with their sovereign. The word capituler appears in various declensions over 50 times in the text, always singled out in italics. Capituler, Coras writes in the introduction, conveys nothing more than, and here I'm quoting, to transact, contract, negotiate, or other words of similar meaning. And it finds its origins in dealings in which there are several articles or chapters on which parties agree. Thus, from the very beginning, the renowned Toulousan jurist normalizes a word that he suggests has been wrongly assigned negative and subversive connotations in popular discourse. To accuse subjects of lèse-majesté, or treason, who demand the right to negotiate with the king, he goes on to argue, represents a profound misreading of social reality, historical precedent, and natural law. Now, as Coras contends, kings negotiate with various subjects as a matter of course, routinely signing contracts with administrators who maintain their princely domains, with artisans, masons, carpenters, architects, who build and maintain their princely residences. And here I'm quoting. He writes, they buy and sell, contract marriage, and even engage in litigious negotiations, procès et différends, with their subjects. To say then that subjects cannot capituler, negotiate with their prince, ignores the quotidian duties of kingship. Moreover, to suggest that a prince should not negotiate with subjects ignores the imperatives of true leadership, suppressing interactions essential to the proper governance of the kingdom. As Coras asserts, here I'm quoting again, if a prince does not communicate daily with those he governs and rules, if he does not understand the actions, mores, and policing of his kingdom, if he does not consult with those of all estates on which the republic is composed, he cannot properly administer the state. Coras posits the isolation that inevitably follows as a deep social rupture against the natural order, one that deprives subjects of, quote again, participating in the life and humanity of their prince, and equally the king of the services that he receives from his subjects, end quote. And he goes on to suggest that those with great wealth and authority and the consequent responsibilities that come with it should expect to engage in more frequent negotiations than their inferiors. So Coras' opening fashions his treatise as a modest proposal, I want to argue, focusing on peacemaking at a time when most of the pamphlets issuing from Berton's press were much more stridently militant, justifying la prise des armes, right, the taking up of arms, and the resumption of hostilities otherwise known as the Third Religious War. Of course, what he goes on to say is really subversive. In the succeeding pages of the text, Coras introduces a number of arguments that scholars have associated with the more famous resistance theorists of the 1570s and 1580s, Oatman, Beza, and Duplessis-Mornay. We find evocations of the primeval pact between the king and his subject that is reciprocal and mirrors the alliance between God and his creation. The elective monarchy and conditional obedience owed by subjects. The key role played by representative institutions and lesser magistrates in restraining the excesses of royal power. The origin myths is integral to Huguenot resistance theory are all present in Question politique, a political question, although Coras is the only writer who dares to suggest that human beings in the original state of nature were equal. With Question politique, Coras is fundamentally recasting the paradigms of governance and monarchical authority. But he is also speaking to a specific political moment. As Coras took up his pen in the fall of 1568, he and fellow members of the Huguenot Party were still reeling from the consequences of the Edict of Saint-Maur, promulgated by Charles IX in September 1568. Surrounded by the most ardently Catholic members of his privy council, Charles had summarily revoked all of the previous edicts of pacification, including the most recent Edict of Longjumeau of 1568. These were all edicts that had granted some measure of religious freedom to the Reformed community in France. The September edict was followed by a second decree depriving any official evincing Protestant sympathies of their post, and that certainly must have struck even closer to home. With one swift stroke, the young monarch reestablished Catholicism as the sole religion of France and nullified 7 years of peacemaking. It was a stunning volte-face from a sovereign who had faced down his royal courts or parliaments when they refused to register his early edicts of pacification, most notably in 1563 as a fresh-faced adolescent of 13. But what was especially chilling for Huguenots was the fact that the Edict of Saint-Maur was positioned as the first formal expression of a king who had finally reached legal maturity after assuming the throne at the tender age of 10. Charles's transition from a boy king to adult monarch in full possession of his regalia and authority is one of the central narratives around which the edict is framed. Now, this is a legal fiction. I mean, the text glosses over the fact that Charles had actually, at the age of 14 in 1564, right, become king in his own right. But this fiction supports, right, the contention in the edict, right, that the peacemaking process was null and void during the first 2 religious wars by contending that Charles's minority thwarted any true expression of the king's will. The concessions granted to the Huguenots, the edict declares, were only a function of the king's minority, vasage, and his desire for peace, violating his true will and true faith, since, and here I'm quoting, "we have always harbored in our heart the true religion like all devoted Christians must, and we are resolved to live and die in it." And I think this is the crucial phrase, having this hour reached the age, understanding and judgment sufficient to govern ourselves. Moreover, the edict asserts that the agreements that Huguenots had wrested from him were rooted in, again, and here I quote, a contempt for his young age, which in turn encouraged Huguenots, here quoting, to negotiate with him as neighborly relations and not as obedient subjects that they declare themselves to be by their mouths and by their writings, end quote. So Coras' Question politique is a direct riposte, I think, to the Edict of Saint-Maur, and I'm not the only one to say this. And I think it also should be seen as a prologue to the peacemaking that would inevitably follow the taking up of arms. In fact, for Coras to use the term capituler is an intentional reference to the structure of peacemaking, specifically the various capituli, right, chapters or clauses into which the edicts of pacification were divided, stipulating the specific details of the agreement that had been reached by the belligerent parties. The Edict of Saint-Maur laid bare the unreliability of the peacemaking process, which Huguenot theorists from Coras onward would work to formalize or concretize, attempting to bind monarchs to their promises by conferring a contractual value upon the edicts of pacification suggesting they could not be unilaterally revoked without serious consequences. As a professor of law and a jurist, Coras had written extensively about contracts between private individuals, arguing, for example, that debtors and later buyers and sellers could be forced by law to fulfill their agreements. The debtor, he wrote in one of his many legal treatises, and here I'm quoting, can be specifically compelled insofar as he is capable of performing, whether these obligations are to give, over which there is no controversy, or to do, or to restore, or to hand over, and there is nothing that corresponds more to good faith than that it is performed, what is agreed upon between the two contracting parties. So here, Coras is insisting upon the performative element of contract law. And I would argue that he goes on later to suggest that performance is integral to peacemaking too. I mean, it's one thing for a king to sign a decree into law, it's another thing to implement it. And a durable peace cannot be established unless the stipulations contained in the treaty are implemented. Those of us who study the wars of religion, the wars of the 16th century know, and other civil wars, that implementation is always the sticking point. Right? In Question Politique, Coras deploys then the same principles of engagement that he had applied to private parties, now to public authorities, using the vocabulary of contract law to suggest that edicts of pacification had the transcendent force of natural law, and as such were impervious to inevitable shifts in royal policy, advisors, or even a king's passing fancy, and more importantly, subject to the judgment of God and men. Any unilateral withdrawal by one of the signatories was a demonstrable sign of bad faith. So such an argument implies that obedience to a monarch was conditional, and like later Huguenot monarchomaques, a resistance theorist, Coras marshaled historical precedents, albeit a largely mythical past, where early Frankish kings were elected by popular acclamation. They confirmed their election by a coronation oath. The coronation oath bound them to fulfill certain promises upon which a subject's obedience was conditioned. And Coras addresses this in a paragraph where he writes that this election was accompanied by multiple responsibilities, negotiated, capitulé, with them, that is the subjects, such as that they would protect their subjects, preserve them from all oppression, give them justice, and similar articles containing reciprocal obligations one toward another. Of course, the emphasis is always in this text on the king's obligation towards his subjects. Coras also points to the emergence of three institutions, broadly constituting popular sovereignty or magistral authority that historically had checked the egregious expansion of royal power and private interest in France: the Estates General, the sovereign courts or parliaments in which he had served, and the Council of Peers. And in a long passage, he goes into considerable detail how over the past centuries, all of these bodies have fallen into desuetude. Everywhere else, they're flourishing, but in France, they're barely existent. And in failing to consult these traditional advisory bodies, Coras writes, Charles IX risked repeating the mistake of his Merovingian ancestors, who were eventually deposed too by greedy, overweening private councillors, that is, those mayors of the palace that we all know about. In one of the most powerful images in the treatise, Coras describes the dangerous devolution of royal governance to private interests. Increasingly, he writes, decisions are, and here I'm quoting, made in private chambers, in corners by a crackling hearth, or in bedrooms, and he uses the term ruelle de lit, right? These spaces where women and sometimes men received friends for conversations, but certainly not matters of state. The text goes on to depict these as feminized spaces, peopled by, quote, a cluster of women, children, and priests, devoid of princes, chancellors, marshals, or other venerable and serious chevaliers and councillors, and indeed without the seal, will, and consent of the king, to whom are brought pre-digested resolutions. So here, private spaces become a code for the privatization of public authority and the effeminization of royal power, prefiguring not only later resistance theses or resistance theory, but also 18th century discourse on the decadence and corruption of the Bourbon monarchy. Coras takes pains to divest Charles from any conscious responsibility for the state of affairs in France, laying the blame squarely and repeatedly upon malevolent Machiavellian advisors who surround the king and pervert the monarchy. To do so, however, he has to depict the king as weak, given over to his sensual desires, sensualité, and the licentious persuasions of flatterers and sycophants. Elsewhere, he describes the king as being, quote, kept and buried in ignorance as the old mayors of the palace, hoping one day to deprive him of the kingdom, ruin poor old stupid Childeric, end quote. In the last paragraph of the treatise, the transformation is complete as Coras presents Charles IX as a king who no longer submits to reason or discipline, no longer demonstrates compassion for his family, the state, or his subjects. Much like the Croix fainéant, or literally do-nothing kings of the last Merovingian, Coras complains that the king, quote, no longer orders anything, consults anything, registers anything, because all of the administration of the kingdom passes through the advice of an unhinged crazy. Since the subjects of the king can no longer negotiate with their king, they are forced to negotiate for him to preserve the crown and the state. Coras' text is steeped in visceral hatred for the Guises, that great aristocratic family that Protestants, right, in Protestant minds at least had monopolized power through the 1560s, and especially for the Cardinal of Lorraine, Charles of Guise. Coras never actually names Lorraine outright. He dubs him our Panurge, after the crafty libertine in Rabelais' Gargantua and Pantagruel, as we've seen, as an unhinged crazy, but he most frequently refers to him as le paradoxeur, the paradoxer, who perpetuates the big lie that kings, quote, do not negotiate with their subjects, and that doing so makes one guilty of treason. Throughout the text, Coras positions the Huguenots as defenders of monarchy against evil counselors, such as the cardinal, who manipulate, right, the monarchs. And even in various cases, not just the young monarchs, but the mature Henry II is described as the pawn and dupe of the cardinal's machinations. We know monarchomaques, we know resistance theorists recognize the past in order to fashion a more utopian future. And in this text, Coras launches into a very colorful and creative reconstruction of Carolingian history, focusing on the coup d'etat orchestrated by Pepin the Short in 1751. Right? This is a part of Merovingian or of Frankish history that gets very little play or very different treatment in other resistance treaties. For Coras, however, this rupture in Frankish history is instrumental to his efforts to discredit the Guises, specifically the Cardinal of Lorraine, right, who claimed their illustrious status as princes of the blood and peers of the realm from their Carolingian forebears. And I think it's also a strategy to discredit the Catholic Church. In Coras' telling of the story, right, one that I actually tell my own students, right? Pepin the Short, the Merovingian mayor of the palace, the mayor of the palace of King Childeric, works in concert kind of with the Pope to depose Childeric and to create a new kind of dynasty. And in return, Pepin agrees to help the Pope with his problems against the Lombards. And this is the beginning of the famous kind of Franco-Papal Pact. Now, in Coras' telling of the stories, the motivations of Pepin the Short are indistinguishable from those of the Cardinal of Rennes. And as Coras asserts, both utilize the forces of Rome in the hopes of deposing a duly elected monarch to establish a new dynasty for themselves and their heirs. In so doing, both, quote, sowed two venomous strains of infidelity through Christianity that corrupted both the nobility and the papacy, as well as despoiled potentates of their kingdoms, only to establish others in their place. Now, in his conclusion, Coras returns again to his central theme of negotiations, upping the stake by mobilizing biblical examples. starting with, Yahweh's or the God of creation's negotiations with the illustrious Old Testament patriarchs, from Adam, Noah, Abraham to Moses, David, and Solomon. And all of these are seen as covenants that are mere rehearsals for the final kind of compact or convention between God and his community with all humanity through his son, Jesus Christ. Okay. So in the text, I think you can almost hear the rhetorical pause before the seasoned jurist launches his final closing argument. And here I just have to quote again. If the all-powerful one, Coras writes, wanted to contract with and negotiate with his creatures, who are but earthly worms and rot, if he takes pleasure in seeing his promises and contracts accomplished, how can an earthly king who is of the same flesh, blood, earth, and mud, whose authority derives from the election of his subjects, find it wrong, nay, even evil, to negotiate with him? Hugh Dosey writes that Coras' political question was one of the most famous pamphlets published in La Rochelle in the Third Religious War. We know little, however, about the reception of Coras' treatise, even in La Rochelle. There is no evidence, like Francis Oatman, that he sent the work to friends. Simon Goulart admitted the text in his memoirs on the state of France under the reign of Charles IX, even though Oatman, Beza, La Boétie, and two other anonymous treatises are given pride of place in the second volume. Beza himself sent copies of Jean Serre's The History of the Third Religious War, also published in 1570, to a couple of friends, even though he admitted he didn't think it was particularly good, but he never mentions Coras' Question politique in his correspondence. That Beza knew the work and had read it, however, is clear from the 9th chapter of his Rights of Magistrate, published 4 years later. There, the Genevan reformer makes explicit reference to Coras in his 9th chapter, the 9th and penultimate chapter of the treatise, entitled Subjects Can Negotiate with Their Prince. And although it is among the shortest chapters in the treatise, with examples largely drawn from scripture, Beza offers a crucial elaboration of Coras' argument by asserting that new negotiations, or capitulation, are not innovations or changes in the law, but confirmation of what always already exists. That is, that negotiations should be understood as legitimate efforts to clarify former accords and to assure the implementation of former treaties in their entirety. As Beza opines, quote, one is not engaging in a new capitulation with the king, when one insists that the former agreement is valid and should be observed, or when one is attempting to leave room to another who seems more likely to be concerned about their observance. This assertion allows Beza to maintain his own legal paradox that laws are both fixed and fluid, subject to enrichment over time. To Huguenots facing an uncertain future after the infamous massacres of St. Bartholomew's, this open-ended vision of peacemaking was crucial. The resolution, or the clear and easy resolution, simple resolution, I should say, on the question taken up so many times about whether or not the taking up arms by inferiors is legitimate, a text written by an adolescent Odette de Lanoux, who had been in La Rochelle in 1570 when his father served as governor of the city, also bears the imprint of Coras' vernacular in certain passages. Lanoux suggests too that peace is a corollary of war, that negotiation is a part of the peacemaking process, offering that if you object to the word capituler, then let's, suggest another word. We're coming to a good arrangement, bon appointement. Nonetheless, he argues, we're essentially doing the same thing. As Orlette Joanna has demonstrated, Coras attempts to rehabilitate the term capituler, and the process it described continued to be contested in the propaganda wars of the 16th century until the ascent of Henry IV brought an end to the war of words and arms. In his brief but brilliant foray into the world of clandestine print and polemic, Jean de Coras articulated themes that would become the lifeblood of a fully throated, radical reinterpretation of royal authority in the later stages of the religious wars. Although Coras himself was silenced by an assassin's dagger in a provincial iteration of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in October of 1572, his work continued to provide the Huguenot party in France with a potent vocabulary derived from legal theory and practice with which to challenge their opponents. To be sure, his methodology, rhetoric, historical repertoire were part of a common humanist heritage that he shared with his literary successors, but his arguments were so compelling that they were eventually adopted by Catholic leaguers to legitimate their own actions against the king in the last stages of the religious war. Thus, the search for legitimacy, common to all insurgencies, found a potent and original voice in the jurist from Toulouse. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Amanda. That was great. I really appreciate that. And I think there'll be a good discussion afterwards. But right now we'll go straight on and hear from our second presenter, and that is Preston Hill. Preston, it's all yours.
Wonderful. Well, I just want to reiterate as I pull up my timer here to make sure I stay on point. I just want to reiterate my sincere thanks for this facility, for the Meter Center. Thank you for last year, for pushing us to this year. I was, as I attested to Deborah and others, I was just giddy walking through the aisles. My first visit to the Meter Center. So I'm just really, really fun to see and avail of these materials. Right, so the death of the soul, Christ's descent into hell, and the thought of Calvin, Lefebvre, and Cusa. John Calvin devoted 5 times more space in his Institutes to explaining the descent into hell than any other clause of the Apostles' Creed. And this explanation repeats the same interpretation he had already developed in his first treatise, the Psychopanachia. Although Calvin defended this interpretation throughout his commentaries, sermons, letters, and the final edition of the Institutes, constantly expanding and defending his interpretation, never recanting, unlike some of his forerunners and peers. The secondary literature on this theme is virtually non-existent, despite a glut of Calvin research. So far as I'm aware, there's only a couple of articles published in recent years. And in one of these articles, published with the Calvin Congress volume, the most recent one, I suggested that the French humanist scholar Jacques Lefebvre de Taple ought to be considered something of a forerunner for Calvin, because of a shared interpretation between them that's a bit too historically close and conceptually similar to be accidental. In this presentation, I want to supplement that by showing that Lefebvre explicitly relied on Nicholas of Cusa and some sermons, one particular sermon of Cusa, for this interpretation of Christ's descent into hell. And that the similarity between these figures, I think, represents a kind of organic stream of teaching between the late medieval into the early modern period that Calvin's interpretation is situated within. And the major finding I'll be advancing, of course, is that despite popular, what we find in a lot of popular summaries of Calvin's theology, this wasn't novel. This wasn't something unique or idiosyncratic to Calvin. This, in fact, emerges very naturally from his own setting. The other thing I want to query is that when we look at this in a more nuanced understanding, what we find is that the common reduction that Christ descends into hell on the cross for Calvin is just not true. It's not the case that Christ descends into hell on the cross. I hope to show that by looking at his treatise, the Psychopanachia. And this continues this idea as it's a common, I think, because of the Heidelberg Catechism, it's a common way of summarizing Calvin's theology, and the designation is apt, I understand, but it just doesn't do justice to the complexity and the nuance of what you actually find in Calvin's writings and how he understood the descent into hell. And so to embody sort of this just is perpetuated to the present day, but I'll just give a quote from a very recent book that shows kind of the opinion I'm trying to complexify a little bit. This comes from Matthew Emerson's book, He Descended to the Dead, an Evangelical Theology of Holy Saturday. And you'll find this kind of thing said in a lot of systematic textbooks. Quote, Calvin's view is entirely novel with respect to the views of those that preceded the Reformation. Never before had anyone placed Christ's descent on Friday or made it an instance of torment. All before Calvin had affirmed that Christ descended to the place of the dead, but not the place of the unrighteous dead, to be tormented. One might ask why Calvin came up with this view. Well, that's exactly what I want to ask. And of course, I want to suggest he didn't really come up with it, and that his view is a bit more nuanced than that. So with that, let's turn to Calvin and the Sycophannikia. The Sycophannikia, of course, is a really neglected Calvin treatise by Calvin. And I think it's not incidental that Calvin's descent theology is reduced and not understood, because this is where it first appears in the Sycophannikia. And what we find in the treatise, of course, it's on the immortality of the soul. Calvin is defending against certain mortalistic views of the soul, either that the soul is, when the body dies, the soul sleeps, or the soul was never there to begin with because you're a materialist, or the soul dies, literally dissipates like the body. Calvin is rejecting these interpretations, maintaining what he thinks is orthodox, the immortality of the soul. But what's interesting about Calvin is this whole tract does it on the basis, many of the key arguments are funded by his Christology and his atonement theology. His understandings of the person and work of Christ drive a lot of his arguments. So for that reason, I think his reference in the Sycophannikia to Christ's descent into hell, it's not an isolated reference to an incidental doctrine. It's actually the formal designation of an atoning intervention that I think is at the heart of the whole treatise. And the reason why is because Calvin fundamentally understands Christ's descent into hell here in the Sycophannikia, and later throughout the Institutes and all of his other works, as the death of the soul. I think that's a governing sort of central feature of his interpretation. And of course, this is how it connects with the immortality of the soul. So to understand how Calvin situates it, we have to understand, before we understand the death of the soul, it'd be good to understand what Calvin means by the soul. In the Sycophannikia, he gives a wonderful little definition, which I'll quote from here. For those who admit that the soul lives, yet deprive it of all sense, fain imagine a soul which has none of the properties of soul, or dissever the soul from itself, seeing that the soul's nature, without which it cannot possibly exist, is to move, to feel, to be vigorous, to understand. As Tertullian says, the soul of the soul, the soul's own soul, is perception. Animae anima sensus sit. So the idea here is that it's quite simple. Calvin's saying that an unconscious soul, to speak of an unconscious soul is an oxymoron. It's a contradiction of terms. The soul is essentially the phenomenon of human consciousness, of perception, right? Of intellect and will, perceiving, discriminating between good and evil, and then moving toward it with the will. And so to speak of the soul dying in the sense that the body dies, as if it could dissipate or annihilation, is just a contradiction of terms. It's to talk about the soul as if it were a kind of second body. And Calvin wants to say, again, because souls are always conscious, that's what it means to be a soul. This requires a reinterpretation of the death of the soul. So essentially, Calvin's confronted with this problem. If the soul is consciousness, basically, and again, I'm moving very broad brushstrokes here, moving very quickly, but what does it mean for consciousness to die? And so Calvin asks this question directly in the treatise. I ask whether or not there is to be any end to that death, the second death, the death of the soul. If none, as we must certainly acknowledge, again, because it's consciousness, these things make it manifest that the immortality of the soul, which we assert, and which we say consists in a perception of good and evil, exists even when it is dead, and that death is something else than the annihilation to which they, the soul sleepers, would reduce it. So again, then Calvin, okay, Calvin, I'm following you. Well, if the soul dies, but it doesn't cease to exist, then what is the death of the soul? And Calvin gives this answer, and this is exactly where he slots in Christ's descent into hell. Dust will return to dust. This is said of the body. The death of the soul is very different. It is the judgment of God, the weight of which the wretched soul cannot bear, without being wholly confounded, crushed, and desperate. And then he references Adam, when God calls to Adam, passes the judgment. You will die the death, right, in the Garden of Eden. Would you know what the death of the soul is? It is to be without God, to be abandoned by God, to be left to itself. For if God is its life, it loses its life when it loses the presence of God. What more do you require of death? For although the mind retains its powers of perception, yet evil concupiscence is, as it were, a kind of mental stupefaction. Then such death as the soul endures, Christ underwent on our account. And this is the confession, he says later, picks this back up. And this is the confession which we make in the creed, that Christ descended into hell. In other words, he was subjected to all the pains of death. He endured its agonies and terrors. And so this is very, very compelling. And Calvin, what he's saying is, again, the death of the soul is not quantitative decay like the body, it's qualitative condition. It's a psychological adversity in which the soul, having passed into the intermediate state under the conditions of the fall, as a child of Adam, the soul perceives itself to be engaged in an adverse relation with God. Again, this is the classic Calvin thing of God is the judge, not the father, in the intermediate state. That's what the death of the soul is. He's very clear on this. Now, before we move to Lefebvre and Cusa, there's one more thing to note here. In the first place, Calvin is very clear in this construction that when he refers to the death of the soul in Christ as Christ's descent into hell, he's referring to the intermediate state, a disembodied state of ruin. He's very clear about Christ's cry of dereliction, "Why have you forsaken me?" That appears in the Psychopannychia. And he says, those who are dead, buried, carried into the land of forgetfulness are called forsaken of God. So what I want to just propose here is Calvin's being very clear, in the very least, that the qualitative condition of God forsakenness that he wants to apply to the soul of Christ, it's materially referring to a disembodied state of ruin. We might say Holy Saturday is being included here. So the idea that there's no room for Holy Saturday in Calvin is just not true based on his whole construction, right, of the intermediate state. But as Lyle Bierma, hello Lyle, it's really great to see you here, he brought this to my attention at the Calvin Congress, and I was really grateful for it, that of course Calvin says it is finished and it happened at the cross, and Christ offers up in a bundle of souls all the elect to God when he says, "Into your hands I commend my spirit." And this is part of the whole point of the Psychopannychia, that Christ in the intermediate state has the beatific vision. He does not have the, again, he acquires the peace that the elect repose in the intermediate state. So then we ask this question, Calvin, how can you have your cake and eat it too? Sounds like both sides of your mouth. You're saying Christ has the death of the soul, but you're also saying Christ in the intermediate state experiences the beatific vision. So which is it? And I think Calvin provides the answer. Similarly, that I found actually here, I found in Zwingli and Bullinger, thank you, Meter Center Resources, making very similar distinctions, I think, that what is happening is a kind of prolepsis, or a kind of meditation of the future, a kind of anticipation of the judgment of God. And Calvin indicates this in the Psychopannychia. He says, to pull one quote to evince this, Christ does not deprecate death, but that grievous sense of the severity of God with which he was seized by death. So in other words, this is Calvin's constantly talking about how Christ, he's fearing what is to come. He's fearing the judgment, I think, of the intermediate state in Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, etc. So the way I summarize all of this, to move on, of course, to Lefebvre and Cusa, is that Calvin seems to solve this problem with a complex arrangement, according to which we could put it a couple of different ways, but a very simple way to say it is Holy Saturday is sort of front loaded onto Maundy, Thursday, and Good Friday, that Christ is somehow experiencing the death of the soul of the intermediate state prior to that chronologically. Chronologically, it's on Thursday and Friday. So let me make sure I've got all that covered. So with all of that, we might want to ask at this point, where did this come from? And was this very original to Calvin? I mean, again, he's 20-something years old potentially when he's saying this first treatise. He failed being a humanist, you know, the die are cast, and no one purchased his commentary on Seneca, and he's trying his hand at the immortality of the soul, penning the Institutes, fleeing France. Like, this seems really bold. Where did this come from, young Calvin? And you find people say, as I quoted earlier, it's very common in all the sources when I was doing this research that I found, say, even Calvin scholars say, this was kind of very new and innovative departure from tradition, all of these things. I just want to try to suggest here that I don't think that's the case. I think Calvin is drawing on I think what was in the air in his day from Lefebvre, humanist exegesis of the scriptures, and from Cusa. So let's move to Jacques Lefebvre de Taple. He was, of course, a humanist scholar who taught at the University of Paris, was causing a lot of trouble, was doing exegesis, and the Sorbonne faculty did not like that. And in 1517, he published a text called De Maria Magdalena et Triduo Christi, and he was sort of doing his exegesis, harmonizing the gospel accounts of the three Marys and talking about the Triduum events of Friday, Good Friday, Holy Saturday, Easter Sunday. And for our purposes, in De Triduo, talking about the Triduum, Lefebvre, of course, Calvin at this time is 1517, very, very young Calvin. Lefebvre proposed in this text alternate ways of accounting for the passage of time prior to Christ's resurrection. He was arguing against Erasmus. Erasmus said Christ rose on the third day. Lefebvre says he rose after 3 days. And Lefebvre says that because Christ says in Matthew 12, I need to spend 3 days in the heart of the earth, which Lefebvre took to mean the underworld. But of course, if Christ is going to spend 3 days in the heart of the earth, Lefebvre says, well, we've only got Friday night, Saturday night. So this is the problem of the third night. Where is the third night? And Lefebvre says, well, there's 2 ways we might go about finding this third night that Christ predicted he was in hell, in the heart of the earth. One, you might say with Ambrose that when darkness covered the land and the crucifixion, there's your mini night, right? A little small mini night, the literal Friday night and the literal Saturday night. There's your 3 nights. He says, or you could say that Christ began descending into hell on Maundy Thursday when he was sore amazed and heavily anguished, in the Garden of Gethsemane. And Lefebvre says this in De Triduo, and it's a very worthwhile quote connecting to Calvin. Sending Christ down to the underworld before that day, when he was in the garden. In the garden, the Lord anticipated the underworld and was present there by his apprehension of it. And those pains which the Lord suffered in his soul in the garden were so bitter and unbearable, greater than any mortal. And we do not read that this happened with the bodily pains he had to suffer on the cross. For these, although they are the greatest of all such pains, cannot possibly be as great as those of soul. Through these pains of Jesus, of his total humanity, no less of the body than of the soul. So again, we've got Lefebvre in 1517 here saying, highlighting a couple of key points that I think are shared directly in common with the Sycophannikia that then Calvin further develops in the Institutes, in the subsequent editions of the Institutes. And those features are an explicit body-soul distinction. Calvin's very clear in the Institutes, of course, in his teaching on the descent into hell that, again, if Christ had only died a bodily death, he would have been the redeemer of bodies alone. But that this refers to the price, the greater and more excellent price he paid in his soul than in his body. So Calvin apparently thinks the descent into hell is greater and more excellent than the crucifixion. I mean, that's just taking him at his word, what he's saying, soul and body. Another, of course, key element here is the proleptic anticipation during Gethsemane of the pains of hell. That there's sort of, Christ is present in hell by his apprehension of it, his meditation upon what's coming. And that's, I think, exactly what Calvin's saying in Sycophannikia. And the other is that Christ is the greatest of all possible sufferers for various reasons. You find this in Erasmus too, and other like texts of the time. Yes, we've got that. So I guess now it's time to go to Cusa. Just following my clock here. What's interesting about what Lefebvre had offered here in the De Triduo of 1517 is that he directly cites the German cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, the medieval German cardinal. On these most bitter pains of Jesus, read, if you will, Cusa. And this reference to Cusa is not the first one, the first time Lefebvre references Cusa as an inspiration for his interpretation of the descent into hell. He had already said in 1509, in his Quincuplex Psalterium, his fivefold Psalter, in a commentary on Psalm 30:11, he offered a commentary. The Psalterium was a compilation of various translations of the Psalms, and he was offering commentaries on it. This was Lefebvre's Christological exegesis of the Psalms, Christoformitas, and all of that. And the entire work became famous of all the Psalms for this one little commentary he offered on Psalm 30, verse 11, undecimo versu, where he talks about, he elaborates on Cusa's interpretation that Christ descended into hell, that he experienced hell. And so this is, I'm going to quote here, I had to look this up. I actually had the help of David Noe here at Calvin to make sure I got my translation right of the Latin into English here, because it hasn't been translated yet. But this is Lefebvre's, his commentary on Psalm 30:11, again, that the whole work became famous for, as I'll talk about in a moment. There are those, this is Lefebvre, there are those who want the Lord not only to have carried the pains of an earthly death for us, but also to have sustained the pains of hell in his soul, in order that he might set free Adam, who had incurred the second death in his transgression, and Adam's posterity from the pains of the second death. This is what Cusa perceived in his sermons when this was introduced, but this is the opinion of Cusa. At first glance, it seemed to me not only pointless, but also shocking and dreadful. And so I began to ponder it more anxiously. So this is Lefebvre giving us an autobiographical account of being horrified by Cusa's musings on Christ suffering like a damned person. And this is really fascinating to me, that you find in the McNeill and Battles Institutes, and you find this constantly cited a lot of places, that Cusa preached a sermon on Psalm 30, and that's where Calvin got his view from. I think most people think this because they read Lefebvre saying this in his commentary on Psalm 30, a sermon from Cusa, but there actually is no, I've conferred with Thomas Isbicki on this, that there is no sermon that Cusa preached that I've ever found. I looked them up in his works on Psalm 30. It seems to come from a sermon on Hebrews 9 that Lefebvre seems to have consulted. And that sermon from Cusa, again, medieval preaching here, mystical preaching, it goes like this. The vision of death is the consummate punishment. Now, Christ's death was the consummate punishment, where he had a vision of death. Christ descended into the lower regions, the lower and deeper hell, where death is seen. Therefore, if you rightly consider the matter, Christ's suffering, than which there cannot be a greater suffering, was as the suffering of the damned, who cannot be more greatly damned, i.e. was suffering all the way to punishment in hell. So there's the radical, I think that's the radical claim that Lefebvre was struck by. And the idea here is actually quite simple, I think. It's the idea that, and again, as I say, I was really happy to find this also in Zwingli and Bullinger, that Christ suffered, that Adam merited not only bodily death, but the death of the soul. And if Christ is going to atone for Adam and Adam's posterity, it's got to be not just a bodily death, but paying some kind of price for the soul. So the entirety of human nature, because otherwise it's not redeemed. So because Adam merited the second death, Christ has to suffer the second death in some sense. So now, with all of this, the really fascinating thing is that, and this will be my last point before drawing this to a conclusion, Although Lefebvre had been persuaded by Cusa, his contemporaries were not convinced. And the publication of 1509 received criticisms for its, again, its Cusanian interpretation of Psalm 30:11. And in response, Lefebvre published a second edition of the Psalterium in 1513, this time prefixed with a 12-page apologetic clarification, an apology of his suggestion that Christ had suffered the pains of hell. And it's a really fascinating read and kind of moment in early French Reform here. But on the whole, Lefebvre seeks to clear himself of two errors. And the way he tries to get out of this apologize to his critics, I think shows kind of, it gives us a hint of kind of how Calvin developed his point as well. The two errors are that of what I'll call docetism and demonizing Christ. That's a quote from another Cusanian scholar. The docetism point is this: if Christ suffers the death of the soul after the cross, it seems to trivialize the crucifixion. It seems to, this is the whole "it is finished" objection. And to this, Lefebvre says, no, guys, I'm Orthodox, one oblation, it is finished, the cross was enough. And then the second problem is that of demonizing Christ. And the problem here is that if you make Christ suffer like a damned person, it seems to be very scandalous. You seem to be, again, demonizing Christ. You seem to be calling his divine status into question somehow. And Lefebvre, to this, he used a really fascinating, I think, sort of Tychonian exegetical strategy of the head members distinction. So he said that when Christ suffered, he didn't suffer in his person, but he suffered in his members, i.e., either his body or his mystical body, the church. He suffered on behalf of those who he's standing in for. So he wasn't sinful himself, he wasn't damned himself, but in a substitutionary way. So in the end, all of this, what we have Lefebvre is he's trying to have his cake and eat it too, I think. He's trying to satisfy the concerns of his critics with this apology, to remain Orthodox, but also still see himself in continuity with this Cusanian sympathy, if you will. So with all of this, again, Lefebvre, this was a scandalous interpretation that was widely, would have been widely known, again, at Calvin, young Calvin at the University of Paris. It's hard to imagine, it's possible. I'm not claiming any genetic causal links here at all. I am for Cusa and Lefebvre because Lefebvre cites Cusa, but I haven't found Calvin citing Lefebvre. But it seems very hard to imagine that Lefebvre could have become infamous for this issue on the descent into hell, and that Calvin at such a young age could have published such similar things without having any awareness of Lefebvre. I think at the very least, we can say this was, I think, part of the late medieval, early modern lay piety of reform and verve about Christ's atonement that was in the air as Calvin was coming of age. And to close this, let me quote from, I'll offer you two little quotes here that I think are good summaries of what I'm trying to get at here. One is from Jean-Claude Lagarrigue, a Cusanian scholar. He's got a lovely essay called The Infernal Suffering of Christ, Lefebvre, Cusa, and Luther. Quote, when we look at it in the full, the rupture of Luther and Calvin on this article of faith does not form a radical fissure. The reformers in their work would only come across as innovators to those who ignore or want to ignore the Cusanian tradition, present in the church at least since the beginning of the 16th century. And this is another quote from a more recent work by Thomas Joseph White, a Roman Catholic theologian, in a book, a really delightful book called The Incarnate Lord, a study in Thomistic Christology. Of course, I was very happy reading this coming from a Roman Catholic scholar today. Quote, the idea that Christ suffered the pains of damnation on the cross for the sake of sinners was not an idea unique to Protestant thinkers, such as Luther and Calvin. It was taught by many Catholic thinkers of the late medieval period and was a theme in popular preaching in Catholic Europe. John Calvin, therefore, is not unique or exclusively Protestant in holding to a form of penal substitution theory that posits Christ's experience of hell on the cross. Of course, I would want to add to that that on the cross is a convenient shorthand that needs to be nuanced a little bit. So that is the gist. I'll stop there so we can do what's next. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Preston. That was great. What we're going to do now, I think there's not that many of us. So your options are for asking questions. Our usual strategy is for you to post something in the chat, and I would encourage you to do that. But if for some reason you prefer to unmute and ask your question, I'm going to shift to gallery view, and I'm going to keep an eye on as many people as I can. And if you wish to go ahead and unmute and ask your question, you can do so too. I think I have 3 screens to watch, so I'll be watching, but if I don't catch you, just take your time. I'll get to you as I can. I want to start myself, however, with a question, first of all, for Amanda. Who do you think the audience was for Jean de Coras' work? Like, was there a preface? Does he give any indication as to whom this work is directed?
Thanks. Yeah. You know, in the first, I'll just say, that in the question politique, it's really hard to determine. And one of the things that I'm, struggling a little bit also deals with the issue of publication. I can see that first pamphlet in 1569, of which there is no trace, would have been in a format where it clearly would have been widely circulated. He writes in the vernacular. I think, he's obviously addressing kind of an educated elite, but one of the things I've been questioning is who buys the 800+ page compendium that is issued in 1570, and there are several of these, as you know. I mean, Goulart's Goulart's 3-volume treatise on the history of Charles IX. Also, I mean, these would have been massively expensive kind of works, right, to produce, and I'm assuming that they would be kind of expensive too. So, who did he intend his audience to be? Fellow Protestants, but I also think kind of fellow Catholics. I mean, moderate Catholics. I think he's trying in this work to create a platform, as he is in that first small treatise too on the about the Parliament of Toulouse. Which he writes, I think I told you this, as a letter. He assumes the identity of a canon of a kind of local church, the Church of Saint Etienne in Toulouse, and he writes a letter to a friend, an unidentified friend, about the horrors of the expulsion and judicial politics and the necessity for reform in Toulouse. So I think that both of these are really directed to the same audience, right? And his emphasis, I think, on peacemaking too, is an intent to kind of bring it down. I mean, there is rage in these treatises, as I indicate in my title. But I think to bring it down and to try to kind of sound, I don't know, centrist isn't the right word, but a kind of more moderate tone. It isn't as stridently militant as these other remonstrances and petitions and even open letters that are part of the volume, and to try to get some kind of moderate Catholics on side. Right, that politique party, that by 1568 is, increasingly non-existent, represented by the chancellor, by Michel de L'Hopital, who's been sidelined at this point. And eventually, is he already in retirement or not? I can't quite remember. And so I think he's trying to resurrect a kind of, a centrist kind of alliance between moderate Catholics and Protestants.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Jim West has a question. Jim.
Yeah, my question's for Preston. I'm really fascinated by your observation that Calvin's discussion of the descent into hell didn't receive a lot of treatment. Why do you think that is? Do people just kind of disregard that little bit of the creed, or is there something they find objectionable in Calvin's discussion? I'm curious as to why they wouldn't engage it.
Yeah, I am too, because it seemed, I think on one hand, people have and do address it, but don't realize they're talking about the descent into hell. I think the thought is that it's just the crucifixion. So there's a lot of talk on the crucifixion and the cross and atonement. And I think the descent into hell kind of just gets a tagline, like it's just referring to the crucifixion. I think it's the other way around, actually. because again, it's the soul. So I think maybe there have been a lot of people thinking, writing about the descent into hell and Calvin not realizing it, but it just goes by the name of the cross or the crucifixion. But this is, I think Calvin makes a kind of taxonomy here, a distinction between body and soul that was pretty consistent and important to him. I don't know why else. I mean, it is pretty curious also if you're reading through the Institutes. I remember the first time I came across it, it was very strange. It's hard to know what to make of. He spends a kind of a brief, it's a nice cadence, right? One paragraph on birth and dead and buried, and then you get to descent into hell and it's this sprawling chapters, and he's talking about the soul and Gethsemane, and it seems like, Calvin, well, you've lost your order here. You know, I thought this was supposed to be brief and ordered, but if you just kind of pull it apart a little bit, I think it makes sense as to why he's developed. It's like he kept tacking on defenses throughout his career of his interpretation, and it amassed to this big tumor in the Institutes in his explanation of the creed. That's beautiful, and it's part of his earliest development, I think.
He clearly had a lot to say about it.
Yeah.
On that line, I'll continue with the question from Lyle Birma, also to you, Preston. Where does Luther fit into this picture of the medieval and Reformation development of the doctrine of the descent?
Yes, well, of course. I mean, I have to say, Lyle Birma immensely helps me with your unpublished 16th century, I think, paper on this issue of Calvin and Luther and Heidelberg. I mean, again, an organic link can be seen in the Heidelberg Catechism uses the word Anfechtung, which is Luther's whole category of it's an indeterminate range of emotional, spiritual turmoil and distress. And I remember also reading, there's a great article in the journal Perichoresis by, what's his name? It's called Luther versus Luther, and it's essentially looking at the way the story is often told is that Calvin had a infernal kind of suffering view on Good Friday of the descent, and Luther had a victorious descent, Christ marching down, body and soul undivided, the Torgo sermon. When you look at it, that's actually the exception to the rule, and Luther most of the time has a very to speak anachronistically, a very reformed and infernalist interpretation of Christ's suffering like a damned person. And I think you find there's a really interesting marginal note. I think Luther had a copy of Lefebvre's Psalter, and there's a marginal note of Luther writing in there. I think the translation is something like Lefebvre's on to something when he's talking about Cusa or something like that. Like he's on to something here. And that's just really interesting. I think, again, this is the picture of it's a lot more organic and has to do with the early evangelical fervor of getting excited about atonement and Christ and all is accomplished and justification and all of that. So Luther definitely is Calvin's forerunner as much as Lefebvre, I think.
Yep. And they're all kind of intertwined, and they don't unfortunately always tell us, and I just read so-and-so and they've inspired me to write so-and-so, but unfortunately they don't do that. We have a question from Jill Falison for Amanda. I'm struck, Jill says, by how, when we look more closely at those involved in negotiations, individual views are often shifting, particularly on the Protestant side. How does this complicate our understanding of the negotiations during the French Civil Wars?
Great. Well, I'll say first that, the most obvious thing, and something that I sometimes struggle with doing in my own work, and that is to avoid the binaries, right? It's not just Catholic and Protestant. There are moderate Catholics, and I mean, a perfect example of this is in 1573 in the siege of La Rochelle, where there also seemed to be some reverberations maybe of a political question, and they're engaging in these kind of scholastic debates between moderate Protestants who want to give up the ghost and negotiate with the government, and radicals who you want to if worse comes to worse, cede the city to Elizabeth I of England, to English English custodianship. And so, I mean, I think the first thing is, clearly, just working as, people are doing much better than I am often, to kind of complicate the binaries that are often, a part of a simplistic telling of the religious wars. The second thing I would think too is that to think of negotiations, I mean, to focus too on the locals, right? There are these negotiations, I mean, peacemaking. And I think that's one of the things he's talking about in Question Politique. I mean, there are references to that peacemaking not only takes place at the highest levels, he's going to find out in the next stage of his career after he leaves La Rochelle and he's helping in southern France, that peacemaking takes place that all kind of peacemaking also has to take place at the local level. And if the issue is that a peace isn't durable unless it's fully implemented, right? At least on the Protestant side, or a peace isn't durable and the promises haven't been held unless it's implemented, then those interactions are taking place at the local level with a whole series of local actors who have different agendas. And we see this, to refer to another chapter in the book, in the book, we see this in the negotiations that he engages in. I mean, really low-level, petty negotiations about the exchange of prisoners and the, return of ransom goods, and that all of this is also part of the peacemaking process that he will become intimately aware of in the in the next stage of his career.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It looks like, Preston, you have a question. Let me just see if we got it typed out or if this is something else. Now, Preston, you have a question for Amanda, am I right?
Yes. I thought it'd be easier just to ask Amanda.
Yeah.
I was really fast. My question is to do with Coras and Beza. And I was fascinated by the Coras uses, there's the a fortiori argument that if God negotiates, how much more should the king, or can the king negotiate, and the subjects can have that interaction, the dynamic sort of negotiation between them, capitulation. My question was going to be, well, but like Beza would probably hold to some kind of classical attribute of God where God doesn't repent. When he's talking to the patriarchs, this is maybe, as Calvin would say, divine accommodation, but there's no actual negotiation between the transcendent and contingent because God is infinite and all of that. And then you said, I was interested, you said Beza, his phrasing was a negotiation which is a confirmation of what already existed, not a new capitulation. And so I was wondering, that makes sense given like some reformed orthodox things about classical attributes of God and not any actual negotiation with God. I was curious, do you think that Beza is talking in a different way than Coras? Would Coras have said these things about a confirmation of what was already decreed, or is there an actual more open dynamic negotiation in the way we would normally mean? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, let me just, I guess I would say that this notion of a dual alliance is you find in most resistance pamphlets, right? And it's a way too of making the negotiations taking place at the human level have a more transcendent form. I mean, there is, but I would, suggest there that I think that Beza, I mean, he is speaking to something to again, like Coras, a specific political moment. And I hadn't thought about the fact that the way in which he thinks about negotiation, may be much more consonant with his reform theology than Coras, who is well read, but of course it's not a theologian. And so, yeah, there may be another, I guess if I'm understanding your question correctly, there may be another element, all right, a theological element to the answer that Beza provides, right, in chapter 9 about the issue of negotiation, right? But I do think there is also this political element that, is suggesting every time, I mean, I hate religious wars, every time we negotiate something, we're not doing something new. And innovation as dangerous. This is a continuous conversation, a continuous negotiation, and we're really reaffirming it. And here again, too, I think that that for Beza, I mean, this is what he gets from Coras, I think, is that the performative element of treaty making is essential, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. But good,
Right,
thank you.
We have a question from Jan Klok for Preston. Preston, you locate thought about the anxiety of hell to late medieval piety, if I understood well. Can it be that the roots of this, however, are less connected with lay piety, but especially in the medieval Passionsfrömmigkeit, coming from Bernard of Clairvaux, Francis of Assisi, and Bonaventure, which puts the accent on Christ's humanity, which led in the late medieval period to an emphasis on his suffering?
Yes. Yeah, yes, absolutely. I think that's right, that there's some obvious consonants here with especially Bernard of Clairvaux and Bonaventure. I haven't read Bonaventure on this point, but I have on others. But that would be very interesting. But yeah, not lay piety exclusively, not at all. Certainly this is part of the broader tradition of placing an emphasis on Christ's humanity. That's exactly right. And that's Calvin's whole point, is that he uses this is why I think, again, the body-soul dialectic or polemic is really important, because he uses it, as Calvin does, as a polemic against heresies to do with Christ's humanity, like monothelitism and Apollinarianism. So he's saying that if Christ has intellect and will and faculties capable of suffering hell, then clearly that presumes the presence of those faculties, which denies those heresies. So
May
yeah,
I react to that?
An
Go ahead,
emphasis on
Jan.
Christ's
Yep, go ahead.
humanity is exactly right.
Exactly what you are saying now does remember me to Bonaventure in his De Scientia Christi. He talks about the knowledge of Christ, and there he explains that Christ already knows everything when he is not when he wasn't born, but when he is on the earth, he learns it by experience. So he already knew it, but when he's incarnated, he learns it by experience. So that's possible the same line of thought.
Oh, absolutely. And this has been, I think you're right. This has been something very interesting looking at Calvin, because Calvin he's trying to pick up a certain patristic vein that gets carried a Minority Report, I think, in the Middle Ages, of Christ's knowledge and ignorance and things like that. So he likes Ambrose on this point. Ironically, Calvin quotes Hilary of Poitiers, who actually said opposite things to this. But yes, you're completely on. I agree with you on that. Yeah.
It looks like Jeff Watt has a question for Preston. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yes, thank you very much. Also, I want to apologize profusely for joining late. I just got distracted, and I'm sorry I missed Amanda's presentation entirely. Preston, I am curious about this descent into hell. The only thing I knew about Calvin's ideas on the descent into hell, I encountered when I was working on my MA thesis 40 years ago, and on Sebastian Castellio. Castellio was turned down for the ministry by Calvin because of two disagreements. One was their understanding of the Song of Songs, which Calvin thought was divinely inspired. Castellio thought it was a dirty poem. The other was a descent into hell. And from the way it's been portrayed, Castellio believed it was a literal descent into hell. Calvin believed it was more figurative. Is that entirely wrong, or does that have to be nuanced, or just what's your take on that?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that. That is a really fascinating point. Yes, of course, he had the disagreement with Castellio on this. One of the most fascinating points of my research was finding a letter from Calvin to Viret, I think, talking about Castellio, and it's a kind of a passing comment, and he says, he references his interpretation against Castellio, and he calls his interpretation, he shorthands it by referencing the cry of dereliction, and he says it's subjoined to Christ's burial. And I think it often does get shorthanded, the literal versus figurative, and I think the literal is a way we oftentimes translate what was more said in the past as local dissent, which I think is more accurate to what they meant. Because, and the reason I say that, I don't think Calvin, well, I think Calvin, he did not think his interpretation was figurative or metaphorical, because he says explicitly in the Psychopannychia that when the word hell is used in scripture or in his theological prose to refer to conscience and terrorized anguish and all of that, he says these words can be taken without a figure. He says that quite literally, that hell is not figuratively terror. It literally is. That's what hell is. It's the condition of a soul and perceiving itself to be engaged in an adverse relation with God. So I think Calvin would say to Castellio probably something like, I have a more theologically nuanced understanding of what hell is than you do. But that's just my guess at what Calvin's getting at.
We have a question from Christine for Preston, and I think we might make that the last one. Christine, go ahead.
Yes, thanks, Preston. I'm questioning you. I'm just 20 feet down the hall, but I'll talk to you this way. Actually, this is kind of piggybacking on Jeff, and I'm actually echoing Karin's very first question to Amanda, which is, why the heck does Calvin write the Psychopannychia? It's such a strange book compared to, I mean, what was he doing? What do you know? Why? Who was he thinking of when he was writing this? Was it just a kind of intellectual exercise on his part to work out some ideas, or does he have an audience in mind?
Yeah, that is such a fascinating question, because I remember Heiko Obermann saying, man, the Psychopannychia, the structure is chaotic, and like Karl Barth saying, this is just like, it feels like it's out of left field, and it really does. When you come across it, it's just this like this wonderful mythical forest kind of like, who is this? I can't believe you wrote this. I think Calvin was, of course, it's written against the Anabaptists in some sense. I think what Calvin's doing is, I like to remember that he was probably composing the Psychopannychia almost nearly contemporary with the first edition of the Institutes, which was going to be prefaced as a sort of political apologetic for the non-radicalness of the reform. This truly is a reform of Christian teaching, of Christian doctrine. And so I find it interesting that he picked up on the immortality of the soul, which was a key issue of thinking whether or not one is in keeping with the Christian tradition coming before. He thought of it as a very fundamentally a thing to do with Christian orthodoxy. We think of the immortality of the soul as tangential and kind of, it doesn't seem as important as if we're Christians, as other doctrines. But I think back then they saw it as fundamental. Maybe one of the reasons, as I say, is the work is like, it's densely a work of philosophical anthropology for sure, but more deeply and fundamentally than that, it's a work in, I think, soteriology and Christology. Calvin's constant reference is souls are immortal because our souls are one with Christ. And if Christ isn't dying, our souls can't die. So it's not on the basis of like, it's not a random philosophical argument. It's actually part of the whole gospel of our souls can escape terror because they're safe in union with Christ. That's kind of the point of it, or the heart of it. So I think it has to do with, again, he's starting to play around with leaving and moving into something else. He's fleeing France, but he's still getting the benefits of the Catholic Church, and he's very young, and he's thinking, how would I cash out this? How do I make sense of? I'm reading Luther, I'm hearing from Lefebvre. Like, how do I make sense of this? I think that's what he was doing.
All right, thank you. So I think at this point in time, we're going to draw this session to a close, but this is only the first of several sessions. So you'll be getting more emails coming out as we go forward. Our next presenter set will certainly involve Christine Coy, who is here with us at the moment, but we haven't fixed a date yet. We're waiting for our next visiting scholars to arrive to set that up. But there will be other opportunities going forward in the summer. But in the meantime, let's just take a moment to thank Amanda and Preston for their presentations today. It was just terrific. Thank you so much. And we wish everyone a good time and enjoy, hopefully, good weather wherever you are. And we will be in touch again soon. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Bye
Thank you.
now.
Bye-bye.